webcast, you may do so by clicking the Ask a Question button located below the presentation. Simply type your question in the box and hit send. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Senior Editor April Hall. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for attending today's webinar. Sorry, I'm just trying to flip the slide there. My name is April Helmer, and I'm Senior Editor for Family Business Magazine, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. But first, let me go over our agenda for today. First, we'll have a short introduction to set the stage for our discussion. Then, as the webinar proceeds, we encourage you to submit questions via the messaging application on the webinar site. David Shaw, Publishing Director for Family Business, will be taking your questions and sharing them with us. The webinar will run for 60 minutes, and we really try to keep to that, knowing we all have very busy schedules. And finally, don't worry about taking notes. The presentation and supporting materials will be emailed to you afterwards. Ownership transition may be the largest and most important financial decision you will make during your lifetime. Given changes in tax laws, the global economy, capital markets, your industry, family dynamics, and other issues, the world is more complex than it ever was. Family financial planning must be aligned and well thought out in order to have a seamless, efficient, and harmonious transition. For this discussion, we have PNC's Joe Fahey, CFA, Senior Vice President and National Director for Business Succession Planning, and Mark Buxton, Senior Vice President and Regional Director for Wealth Strategy. I believe, Mark, you're going to take it away.
Yes, thanks, April. I also want to welcome all of you to our call today, and thank you for joining us. As April just mentioned, ownership transition may be the most important financial decision that a business owner makes during their lifetime. And given the fact that 60% of business owners are now 55 years or older, it is expected that in the coming decade we're going to see more transitions than ever before. However, recent studies show that not all owners are properly prepared for this major event. A study from the Exit Planning Institute indicates that 83% of owners have no written transition plan, and 49% actually have no plan at all. Our belief is that every owner should have a plan in place, and if done correctly, this is a process that will put the owner in a position of control. And it does this by providing them with the information that they need to make the decisions that are going to be best for their business, for themselves, and for their family and loved ones. So on today's call, our goal is to provide you with some valuable insights that will be helpful to you regardless of what stage of the business life cycle you are in. We will do this by sharing with you the process that we use when we're working with business owners, and also by going through a couple of anecdotal stories. Our topic for today's call is strategic positioning for the private business owner. And this may seem a bit wordy, but it does convey the approach and process that we take with our business owners in helping them to anticipate changes on both their business and personal sides of their lives. The strategic aspect of our approach is all about asking the right questions of the owner that will in turn provide us with a better understanding of the business vision and the shareholders' vision. The answers to these questions allow us then to fast forward down the road of life with the owner a little and determine what moves we should be making today that are going to help keep us ahead of the curve. And of course, things can and will change over time in both the owner's business and personal lives. So this should be looked at as a dynamic process and something that should be revisited on a regular basis. So with that as a quick introduction, I now want to turn it over to Joe Fahey to kick us off and get us started. Joe?
Great. Now, thank you, Mark. It's interesting. I'm glad you started with some of the demographics and the survey data because, as you said, you got an aging business owner population, about half plan to keep or do an ESOP, about half plan to sell to a third party, but about 80% are stuck. They're not sure what to do. And that whole notion of strategic positioning, they really haven't been down that road of life before. It's a dark and scary road, as we know. And the reason is because it's too broad and complex. And when you're dealing with business owners who are, used to making good decisions, but only after they know what their options are. So when we look at survey data and anecdotal data, we realize that there really are three primary attributes of a primary advisor. And that's the person. There's a lot of trusted advisor, but who's going to help quarterback this whole plan for the business owner? And so the three things that we see are, number one, is business owners are looking for objective advice. They're getting hit on, I should do an ESOP, I should keep the business, I should sell the business. Really what they want is somebody that has their best interest at heart and can coach them through the various options. But when you think about the complexity of what the business owner is dealing with, ownership transition, oftentimes owner-occupied real estate, they have to think multi-generational in many cases. They might have elder or special needs children or friends, philanthropic goals. It gets really complex. So the second part of it is really then integrating both the business and personal, because in many cases we see clients have done a lot of patchwork planning, and this is too big of a decision on ownership transition to do patchwork planning. So you really need to integrate both the business and personal planning. And then the third thing is, look, business owners are busy running their business. They need somebody to help design that blueprint, and once they check off on the blueprint, to be pleasantly persistent in making sure that it's getting implemented on an ongoing basis. So hopefully those three attributes will show up on a consistent basis in some of the slides that you see. So in trying to, at a very high level, because it gets complicated, if we can start with 5 key questions to sort of help get the client's game face on, I'm going to hit on the first 3, Mark, and then if you would take number 4 and 5. But the first question is really, how should I transition my business? There's only a finite number of options: keep, sell, ESOP, IPO. And what the client's looking to do is fast forward down the road of life and see, what are the pros, cons, and math behind each of these options. And by math, I mean, what does my balance sheet, cash flow, liquidity, and asset protection and risk profile look like on a before and after basis? So the second thing is, when should I transition my business? And this gets a little more complex. The first thing you need to ask is, what's our competitive position today, and how does our strategy for the future, how do our financial and human resources match up to where the industry is heading? And we'll get into that in a little bit in our model. The second thing on when is, what are capital market conditions? And what you really want to know is, what are people paying for companies like mine, and what are the terms? And from that, how does this overlay in terms of the shareholder objectives, all the stakeholders involved in this decision? So in our world, what we really try to help our clients look at is an attractiveness and readiness assessment in terms of, where does their company look like relative to the peers in their industry? And what's best in class, and what are the gaps between where I am today and what's best in class? Then the third thing is, what is the value of my business? And this can mean different things depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So you can see that there's 3 values we have here: strategic, financial, and estate. And I'll start with the middle one, the financial. And this is typically one that, whether you're buying out a partner or doing an ESOP, it tends to be more of a cash flow driven affordability, internal rate of return type of calculation. And that might come in at, let's say, $40 a share. But Mark, you as an attorney for estate type planning, you might say, well, gee, Joe, if we created voting and non-voting and moved a minority interest of non-voting shares, a valuation person might only put a $25 a share value on that. And then, of course, if we went to the M&A community and put out the company up for sale, gave it some competition, we might see that that's a $50 a share valuation. So it really depends that you have a range of values that you can really do valuation planning so that you know what value you want to use for your specific purposes. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind covering questions 4 and 5.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So the fourth question here is, who should benefit from the wealth generated from my business? And this is obviously a decision that's going to be personal for each owner, but we do find that most owners want to maximize the value they can leave to their family and heirs. Beyond that, favorite charities and employees are often included as well. We also find that, similar to the rest of our clients, owners do not want to pay any more to the IRS than is necessary. So we strongly encourage owners to start this planning early. This will provide them with more options and possibly redirect dollars that would otherwise go to the IRS to their family members and other beneficiaries. It also provides them with the opportunity to think about how they want to leave their property. You can obviously leave it outright to individuals, but are there any family wealth philosophies, or is there a need to provide protection against possible litigation and or divorce that it would indicate that leaving the property in some type of trust may be a better option? And early planning will also help to protect the owner, their family, and the business in the event of an untimely death or disability. And then the last question here is, how should this be designed and communicated to meet my objectives? And I'll break this into two parts and start with the design. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is probably the most important financial decision that an owner will make during their lifetime. So this is not something they want to be doing on their own. You want to have a team of experienced advisors who can provide objective advice and help you integrate your business and personal planning. These advisors, like ourselves, are going to have seen mistakes made by others who did not adequately plan. And by having this team in place, you will be in a much better position to avoid these mistakes. Then as for the communication of the plan, this is something that is extremely important. History tells us that only 30% of companies successfully transfer to the next generation. And I think the number goes down to something like 12% when we're looking at the third generation. And there's a number of reasons for this, but the main reasons that are always cited for these failures are, number one, communication and trust breakdown, and number two, the heirs were not prepared. So communication, very important. Now, Joe, I'm going to go on here on the next slide. We have a visual of the scales of justice. And this illustrates the balancing act the owner must perform in dealing with both their personal and business planning. And to me, this slide is extremely important because we often find that business and personal lives of an owner are separate and compartmentalized. And it is not uncommon for us to find that we have different teams of advisors for each life that do not communicate with each other. So, Joe, can you talk a little more about this slide and how it relates back to some of the demographics and survey data that we discussed a little earlier?
Right, yes. So thanks, Mark. Yeah, you can also look at it as a very thin business owner caught in the middle of two strategic plans. The one on the left is the strategic plan for the business to create wealth, and on the right, the wealth plan is designed to keep and protect the wealth that's generated through the business. So you could imagine, a business owner caught in the middle. So what we wanted to do was create an outline of our strategic positioning questionnaire. And so what we've done is we've created a 4-part outline here, as you can see in bold. So business, vision, and strategy, financial, administrative, and emotional. And what we were looking to do is come up with a fundamentally sound outline to compartmentalize our discovery and simplify the complexity, because it gets very complex trying to deal with all these issues, and where do you start? So what we wanted to do, and this is going to be a little bit of an economics 101 refresher. So the 4-part outline actually comes from something that's been around for several hundred years in economics, which is called the factors of production. And, in the agriculture era, a couple hundred years ago, the terminology was land, labor, and capital were the factors or the ingredients that drove production or profitability. Then during the Industrial Revolution, it was man, machinery, and money, or the 3 M's. And then during the post-World War II service economy, it was they added an M. They added management, so man, machinery, money, and management. But what we are looking at here is on the left side, on the business vision and strategy, I think the second economic principle we learned was, at the end of the day, shareholder value is ultimately about a company's ability to gain and sustain a competitive advantage in their marketplace, and it's measured by above industry average metrics. But so in our discovery here, we're spending time on the business first, because that's the goose that lays the golden egg, and asking, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner, tell us what's happening in your industry. Where are you positioned today? Where do you need to take this company over the next 1, 5, and 10 years to gain and sustain that competitive advantage? And of course, we have industry data that we can share and compare notes. Based on that vision, the questions then become, what are the financial and human resources that are needed to drive that vision? And here you can see in the financials, I think most people know that there's a large availability of capital out there to drive business growth. But I think the key here with our aging business owner population is in the leadership and management and demographics. As Warren Buffett would say, without a strong management team, you really don't have a business. And as we look down at the ownership transition in many companies, we're also seeing a demographic cliff in some cases. So in terms of tying the strategic initiatives and incentives plans in place, we're asking a key question like, hey, it's not the team that got you to where you are today, but isn't it the team that needs to take you to where you need to be in the future over the next 1, 5, and 10 years? And do you have a written incentive plan that pays handsomely for your senior leaders to identify, train, and develop your juniors or your farm system so that they're major league ready when the time comes to transition the business? So that whole left side of the model helps us really get a handle on the business dynamics, how well you can compete, and helps drive maybe your decision on should I keep, sell, or do an ESOP. And as Mark said, the things that make businesses great is a communication strategy based off the vision that they have. So let me segue to the right side of the page, because if the factors of production have worked so well for hundreds of years for businesses, why wouldn't it work well for families as well? So we're asking similar questions of the business owner. So Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner, tell us about your family dynamics and your wealth philosophies, and where are you today? Where would you like to be in the future to take this so that you have healthy wealth strategy? And then from that, what are the financial and family leadership resources that are going to be needed to drive that? How are we going to get the income and liquidity and safety for the senior generation's retirement? And if there are estate taxes, how do we minimize the cost of the estate taxes so it doesn't hurt the company's ability to compete long term? So on the administrative side, oftentimes it's mom and dad who are the key leaders here today. But sort of like the business, how do you identify, train, and develop the future leadership for this family and the business? So think of it, on the left side might have a board of advisors, and on the right side a family council to help with the governance. So in sort of wrapping up, I have a term here, optimal shareholder, optimal asset, and it ties into the theme of anticipating change, strategic positioning. One of the things that we're seeing is when you ask a business owner, hey, who are the optimal shareholders who are going to help you and help support your business vision over the next 1, 5, and 10 years. But looking at your existing shareholder group, what are the optimal assets they're going to want over the next 1, 5, and 10 years? So not surprisingly, you might have a business partner, or you might have a family member who is non-active in the business seeking income, liquidity, and safety for their retirement years, not a minority interest in a closely held company that might need to reinvest for growth. So the point on this is what we want to do is go vertical, perfect world business, vertical, perfect world family. And from that, it allows us to deal with the scales of justice and see how well in alignment they are. In other words, what's the business vision and the finance needs of the company? That comes first, but then how do we overlay what everyone wants from a personal planning and their financial needs? And so wanted to give you a quick outline of that model. Interestingly enough, I said there were 3 key refreshers on Economics 101. And if you think about this scale of justice or the business owner in the middle, it reminds me of the definition of economics that we learned on Chapter 1, which is economics is the study of the efficient allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants and desires. Now that's what I was taught. I didn't actually learn what that meant until I had 2 teenage daughters at the same time. So, Mark and I joke that, can you imagine a business owner, taking that definition of economics and how that must resonate with them? So let me spend a few minutes going through our strategic planning process, because it's really, what do we do with the information that we gathered through that integrated business planning discovery tool? Well, the first thing we do is obviously discovery, phase 1, and we talked a lot about that, and we collect a lot of documents and ask a lot of questions. But the key really becomes phase 2. How do we convert your facts, your goals-based objectives, into understanding the pros, cons, and math of any of your succession options, whether it's keep, sell, or ESOP? And from that, we begin to get an attractiveness and readiness of where you are on the business and personal side. And then if there are some gaps, we can point out the insights and discuss what the gaps are so that we can have a roadmap to get you to financial peace of mind. And once we have a good understanding of that, then we can all agree on what the integrated blueprint should look like. And then phase 3 is really a matter of us then coordinating the implementation strategy with a team of specialists, whether it's your legal, your tax, accounting, product specialist, if you're going to take out a loan to buy out a shareholder, whatever it happens to be, or coordinate with an M&A or ESOP team. But I think the cool part of working with business owners, this is my 34th year, is once you've built and implemented a plan, is that you have a body of knowledge on both the business and the personal. And as we begin to anticipate changes in the business climate, or on your part, you might see changes in the business climate or shareholder dynamics, or we might see things in the tax environment, we can be very proactive and help you anticipate some of these changes. So think of this as an iterative, ongoing discovery process. And I just think that it keeps you on track and keeps you competitive. So Mark, if you would help with the next slide in terms of talking about the choices that the business owners have.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, recent studies here indicate that up to 2/3 of owners are not fully aware of all of their exit options. So the studies also tell us that approximately 75% of owners, or 3 out of 4, do experience some level of post-transition regret or remorse. So we believe that it's very important that we discuss each of the available options with the owners to create a level of awareness. Then we go deeper and explore the pros, cons, and financial implications of each option. And as I stated earlier, this is a dynamic process, so it's something that we like to revisit with the owner on a regular basis. And a good example here is an owner that we had worked with years ago in Ohio. He had a son that had always been the natural choice to take over the business, but the son ended up marrying a physician, and he ended up following her back to her home in California. He didn't have any other children, so the owner had to take a step back and explore, think a little broader and explore what the other options were for him. Now, as we look at this slide, at least at a high level, there really are only a limited number of options available. These are a transfer to family members, a transfer to employees, or a sale to a third-party buyer. This slide can really be a webinar in its own, and we will be devoting time to do more of a deep dive on some of these options on a November webinar that we will be conducting, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. So for today, I'm just going to stay at a high level and only briefly discuss each of the three options. And I'll start with the transfer to family members. Here you need to be considering factors such as desire, experience, and aptitude of the family members to run the business as early in the process as possible. In addition, you will need to decide whether you're going to transfer the business by gift, sale, or a combination. We most often find that this decision is guided by how much an owner can gift without jeopardizing their post-exit lifestyle. And the last thing I want to mention under this option is that if you have family members that are both active and inactive in the business, you have other factors you're going to need to consider. Parents may have a wish or a desire to transfer equal ownership to all of their children, regardless of their involvement in the business. But the potential for conflict among the active and non-active children can be substantial, especially as we go down through the generations. So here we often look to see if non-business assets and or life insurance can play a role. And Joe will go a little deeper on this issue later when we get to our first anecdotal story. The second option is a transfer to employees. And this may be accomplished through a sale to a group of key managers or through a sale of the business to an employee stock ownership plan, probably more commonly known as an ESOP. An advantage of a sale to the key managers is that they are usually intimately familiar with the business operations and financials. So the due diligence process here may be a little bit less onerous. Also, having the key managers remain in the business is usually going to provide a level of stability for customers, suppliers, and other employees. So this could in turn increase the likelihood that the business will continue to be successful. But two things to keep in mind. First, key managers don't always make good owners. And second, key managers are unlikely to have the funds necessary to acquire the business in a cash sale. Typically, the management group's going to finance the buyout with debt, and the terms of the sale will usually involve an installment note paid to the owner over a period of years. Now, if you wish for all employees to benefit rather than just a few key employees, an ESOP may be a good alternative. And an ESOP is a qualified retirement plan that is uniquely designed to invest primarily in the stock of the sponsoring company. The plan is also permitted to borrow funds, which is what's going to enable it to acquire the stock. And as participants in the ESOP, employees of the business do have an opportunity to benefit from any growth that occurs in the company stock. Now, I'll mention here that we do discuss ESOPs with a lot of owners, but they're not going to be for everyone. There are a number of factors that you need to consider, such as there are expenses involved in establishing and maintaining an ESOP, and because it is a qualified plan, you're going to be prepared to deal with the regulatory issues, ERISA laws, and the Department of Labor. But it is a very good option for many, and we're fortunate that we internally have an ESOP team that we can leverage in these types of conversations. And the last option is the sale to a third party. This is the option that will usually provide you with the highest return, but you need to be aware that a potential buyer is most likely going to take you through a rigorous due diligence process that involves examining the business from a number of perspectives, including operations, history, properties that it's owned, financials, and any legal matters. So here again, you want to be working with the right team of advisors that understand the factors that a buyer is going to be looking for. Working with the right team of advisors will also provide you with an opportunity to address and improve upon these factors within your company, and this possibly could increase the value of your business. In our second anecdotal story, we'll focus on a little more on this option. Now, as we go on to this next slide, it looks a little busy here, but Joe, I know there's an important message that you want to convey, so if you don't mind, I'll turn it back over to you at this time.
Right, yeah. So don't try to identify the real numbers here. This is really just an infographic to illustrate the sort of the power of collaborating your business analyticals with your personal analyticals. And so, as I mentioned before, the key here is you want to know the pros, cons, and math, but you first start with the business cash flow to make sure that you keep the goose healthy. And then what you're doing is then overlaying any of the options Mark just discussed, and you're seeing the ripple effect of what it might have on your balance sheet, your cash flow, liquidity on a before and after basis to see how that matches up to what you're trying to accomplish. So just not going to spend a lot of time on it. Just know that it's really important that you align your business financials with your personal financials. So as Mark mentioned, we wanted to cover a couple anecdotal stories, and we're going to talk about one on a keep scenario. We're going to talk about one on a sell scenario. And I know this keep paths to ownership transition slide seems a little busy, so it needs some explanation. And I'm going to put some context around this by providing an anecdotal story within it. So as you can see, upper left, you got conflict, not good. Upper right, governance, that sounds a lot better. Lower left, active. In the middle, transition. And then on the lower right, red tape. You can also see that there's an x-axis that has a continuum from far left of no rules, and by that we mean rules of the road and talking about this stuff. And at the far end on the right, many rules where we're actually very communicative. So bottom of the y-axis is you have few owners, and at the top you have many owners. As you can imagine, the exponential growth of owners with second and third generation. So look in the lower left. This is where most businesses start as active owners only. You know, mom and dad can make all the decisions, and then it becomes in transition. And in this particular case, we had a family who mom and dad had this great business. Many of the kids worked within the business, and the good news, it really became valuable and started to become a cash cow. But because of the value, the stakes were beginning to rise on, gee, what are you going to do about the transition? So you can see that there's an arrow. Mom and dad could have said, all right, I'm going to leave it to the active shareholders only. Well, here's the situation. Mom and dad had 7 children, 3 of whom were active in the business, 4 of whom were also very successful, but non-active in the business. And so because it was about 90%, 95% of mom and dad's net worth was tied up in the business, they couldn't figure out a way to leave it to the actives and equalize in some way, shape, or form for the non-actives. So what they did is they crossed the x-axis and allowed the actives and the non-actives to share in this wonderful business and the profits of this wonderful business. So the problem was not what mom and dad left. They left them a great business. The problem was how mom and dad left it. They left it in a way that didn't have family governance and discussions about the issues here. And for example, there were no rules for control and voting because they left it 1/7 equally to 3 active and 4 non-active. There was no rules for anybody coming into the business, compensation, promotion, or whether you were going to distribute or reinvest in the business. So what happened was this family naturally drifted towards the conflict model where the non-actives were saying, gee, actives, you're paying yourself way above market and diluting the earning stream to us. And the actives were saying, look, we're the ones that are creating all this wealth. You're not, even participating in this business. So it was just a natural scales of injustice coming into play. So what this forced was them to either begin to play ball together and have a governance type model, or where they ultimately went was developing a chance for the actives to buy out the non-actives in a way that didn't kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So it's very challenging, and in some cases the business needs to be sold in order to appease everybody. So, but do know that there are just a finite number of options. You either want to be active owners only or have a nice governance. Otherwise, you will drift unless you begin to talk about this. So what we're going to do now is segue into another anecdotal story on a pre-transition selling. So, here we had 3 owners, a 60% owner, 30% COO, and a 10% CFO. And the business, strong opportunities in the industry, just a matter of cloning what they were doing successfully. And they were generating $3 million of EBITDA, and they came to us to talk about what the range of values might be. And, we were estimating about a 6x multiple or $18 million. Well, the problem was the 60% shareholder was independently wealthy, didn't need the money from the sale, but just mentally wanted to get out of the business. The 30% shareholders and the 10% shareholders, they were looking at their financial peace of mind, and they said, well, boss, this really doesn't do much for us. Can we really look and think about continuing to grow the business over the next several years? So what we did is we really, there was a lot of work done, and I'm going to shrink wrap this, that we focused on 3 key elements. What were the competitive dynamics? One, they had the ingredients to grow the company. They had the vision, the industry was strong, and they had the management team to execute on it. So we really felt that they, over the next 5 years, could grow from $3 million to $9 million EBITDA. The capital market conditions suggested that, while you might be at a 6x multiple today at $3 million EBITDA, the multiples go up to 9 at the $9 million EBITDA. So, would I rather sell for 18 or 81 million? And then the shareholder objectives. They all wanted financial peace of mind, but the 60% shareholder was like, listen, whatever we do, I want to go to my kids and grandkids and leave the balance to charities. So with that in mind, we wanted to look at the attractiveness and readiness of both the business and the personal. And now there are, page after page of checklist of attractiveness and readiness. But here I'm just going to shrink wrap it down to 2 real key things that they did that was very successful and helped them sail through due diligence. Basically, they were able to map out their operational knowledge and as well take their financial knowledge. In other words, they were taking their well-marketed opportunities, their backlog, their revenues, and beginning to project budgeted profits. And they were getting audited financials, and as a result, they were able to show that, we're increasing our margins, we're doing this as we grow, and it really, helped them tremendously in terms of growing the business. So in the end, they were able to grow the business, and once they said, look, if we get it to $9 million at a 9x multiple, we're selling. And so they did sell, instead of at 18, they sold it for $81 million. So if this were all we were able to do, right, we were, say the business side was your offensive coordinator scoring and creating wealth, that would have been great. But Mark, doing the wealth planning, you're really a defensive coordinator, and you're trying to keep the IRS from scoring on the shareholders. So can you walk us through an attractiveness and readiness of things that by anticipating change, we were able to help them net more dollars?
Yeah, Joe, like you mentioned earlier, like on the business attractiveness and readiness, there's also a broad and deep checklist of items that we review to ensure that your personal planning is also strategically positioned for any transition. And we have a number of them listed here on this slide. In this particular situation, we did a financial snapshot for each of the 3 shareholders. The 30% and 10% shareholders had fairly basic cash flow, asset allocation, and wealth transfer planning needs, so we were able to handle those. However, for the 60% shareholder who did not need the proceeds of the stock for his lifestyle, the review of his overall plan instead revealed that we had an opportunity. We were able to take his ownership, create voting and non-voting shares, and then moved the vast majority of his own ownership through non-voting interest to trust for his children and grandchildren. And given that the business plan was to grow over the next 5 years, which as Joe said it did, you can see it was fortuitous that we did so. We were able to move the shares at around $7 a share, the non-voting interest by leveraging discounts and some other stuff, move the non-voting shares at $7 a share into these trusts for the children and grandchildren. Ultimately, when the sale was consummated 5 years later, it sold for about $48 a share. So the difference between what we funded these trusts with versus what it was sold with, the difference of about $41 per share, the 48 minus the 7, this avoided this $41 going through his estate and being taxed at 40%. Thus, the assessment that we did allowed for appropriate strategic positioning from a wealth and personal planning perspective as well. The other two key points that we looked at are, first, we made sure that the legal documents that were existing still aligned with the revised financial blueprint. And then second, we took the time to help him describe the overall planning that we had done to his family members, going back to the communication that we referenced earlier. Now, I am going to stick with personal planning, and on this next slide, this really illustrates some of the depth and breadth of the issues that we review during this part of the process. And as you can see, there are a number of issues that can come into play. So Joe likes to refer to this as the headache slide, as it can be a little overwhelming for some. Now, not everything on this slide is going to apply to every owner, but a number of the items such as retirement planning, estate planning, cash flow planning, and risk management do apply to most. So it's very important that you have a plan in place on the personal side of life that coordinates all of these items and keeps you on track. It is our experience that by having a plan in place, you're going to be in a much better position to have enough funds available post-transition to maintain the type of lifestyle you wish to have during this important stage of your life. And we also find that it will better position you to be able to accomplish any legacy goals that you may have for family and or charities. And our overall goal here really is to provide the owner with a feeling of financial security and a feeling of financial peace of mind. And in fact, we find that with many of our owners, this is where it makes the most sense to start the strategic planning process. Having an understanding of what you need from the business at the end of the day can be a very important factor to consider when you're exploring the financial implications of the various transition options that are available to you and that we discussed a little earlier. And the last topic that I will cover with you before turning it back to Joe to start wrapping us up here is the ever-changing landscape of the federal estate and gift tax. And I want to spend just a minute or two on this topic because it can have an effect on your overall planning, and it also fits in nicely with our theme of anticipating change. With the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which took effect on January 1st, 2018, the exemption amount for both the estate and gift tax has now more than doubled. As adjusted for inflation, today, these exemptions are now approximately $11.4 million per person, or $22.8 million for a married couple. And for the appropriate situations, this significant increase provides what is possibly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make tax-free transfers, including transfers of business interest, to family members and loved ones. However, this increase is temporary. As the law stands today, these exemption amounts will revert back to their 2017 levels beginning on January 1st, 2026. And depending upon the outcome of the various presidential and congressional elections between now and then, including the 2020 election, it is possible that we could see legislative changes before 2026 to take the exemption amounts back to their 2017 levels or possibly even lower than those levels. So this is definitely a hot topic for us and something that we are discussing with our clients, both business owners and non-business owners alike. I will also mention that we are recommending that our clients review the terms of their existing estate planning documents. And what we're looking to review here is to see what, if any, effect the increased exemption amount has on the distribution of their property under these documents. We want to ensure that the documents are still in line with their current wishes, and if not, we want to be in a position to make the appropriate changes. So Joe, with that, I will go ahead and turn it back to you to start the wrap-up, and then we can get to April to see if there's any questions.
Great, yeah. So we've got a few self-assessment questions, and you can just jot your own scores down, and this is only for your own edification. Nobody's asking you to hand it in. But the four that we have on the business, how would you answer the following questions on a scale of 0 to 5? Number one being, how strong are your financial controls, and how well do your historical budget projections match to actual performance? Secondly, how would you rate the depth and breadth of your leadership team? And to be able to manage the company if you're suddenly unavailable for 3 months or longer. The third is really how well does your incentive plan reward senior leaders to identify, train, develop, and retain future leaders and key employees? And then fourth, how confident are you that your business has the attractiveness and readiness to sustain a due diligence process in the event you choose to sell to a third party or institute by way of an ESOP? Now on the personal side, the question is really how well does your business plan align with your personal plan and financial needs of other shareholders and stakeholders? How well does your plan reduce estate taxes and protect and preserve your assets? And how comprehensive is your plan? And do you believe it will deliver the financial peace of mind to you and your family that you would hope? A big issue, again, the things that make companies great is their ability to have a vision and communicate. The same holds true with families. How effective are your family meetings? And how prepared is the next generation to maintain those values and philosophies? You can't start too early. And how experienced and integrated is your professional advisory team? So that's a way for you to sort of score yourself. I think as we go into the questions, if we were to sort of wrap and summarize things, there's 3 things to think about here. We hope that you'll come away from this and say, look, it's important that we think strategically and holistically. Let's begin to anticipate and embrace change and conflict because it's going to be there anyway. Might as well see what you can do about it. And then integrate your corporate and wealth strategies. And work with your team of advisors and really try to get consensus building and synergy from your team of advisors to help them review your facts and objectives, identify gaps and positioning opportunities. And I think it's easier to understand your options if you understand the pros, cons, and math, and you look at it in an integrated fashion. So, and then lastly, as Mark said, once you've customized and implemented a new blueprint, make sure you've built in the efficiency, you've built in flexibility in case you change your mind, and that your documents match up to that plan. And then from it, develop a strong communication strategy. So with that, I think what we want to do is just open it up for questions in case anybody would like to bring something up that they have in mind.
All right, gentlemen, thanks so much for this. The information has been really great, and I'm sure there's a lot for people to think about. One question would be, we've heard the saying that valuation planning is both an art and a science. Would you be able to describe what that means and how it would apply to a client who plans to transition their business?
Sure. Mark, you want me to take that?
Yeah, Joe, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So the science of it is there's a revenue ruling that's been around now 60 years called Revenue Ruling 5960. and it's the methodology that the IRS requires a valuation appraisal to put in place to determine fair market value. And back in, several years ago, I used to do some valuation work for a senior analyst and putting the books together. I think the art is looking at this in terms of creating voting and non-voting shares, and then thinking ahead. And in a perfect world, if you think about you want to maintain the voting, the way I try to look at it is there's three attributes of any asset. There's the control, which is the voting. There's the equity, which is the appreciation, and then there's the income. And from a planning standpoint, if you could position it where the senior generation has all the cash flow that they need to maintain the lifestyle to which they like to become accustomed, and had all the voting control and decision making, then they can afford to allow the non-voting shares to grow in the junior and future generations, preferably in a trust to protect them against litigation, divorce, things of that nature. So there really is an art to it in terms of how you position the voting, the non-voting, without giving up the income you need and without giving up cash flow, but at the same time being efficient with it. But the science is, make sure you follow the IRS's methodology and that you have a qualified appraisal that knows what they're doing there.
Yeah, and Joe, I'll just add on. So going back to the example that we had, I mean, there were significant benefits to this family by, understanding what Joe is talking about, and, ultimately having, $41 per share removed from taxation at the end of the day. So more going to the next generation versus the IRS.
Well, and the other part of that story is because he had all the control and could change his mind along the way, and he felt like all the kids and grandkids, because he did all this pre-transition planning, they got more than he ever dreamed he could have left them. It allowed him to leave the balance of his estate to his favorite charities. So instead of a 40% IRS tax on his remaining amount, he just left it all to charity. So effectively, the IRS got zero. The kids probably got about 80% of his overall wealth because of the pre-transition planning. And then the charities got the other 20%. And so it was, a great family culture to have them do good deeds for the community as well.
Okay, we have a follow-on question to that from the audience. So when you're doing valuation, I guess, to this end, if a family business is trying to move from the first to the second or the second to the third or so on, knowing that the business will stay with the kids, maybe one of them or more, what type of valuation needs to be done for the parents to determine value? So this would be staying within is that still subject to the same IRS rules?
Yes. If it's going down through the family, the IRS is going to want to know what fair market value is by their definition, and they have a whole methodology on how a valuation person needs to perform a valuation. It's a roadmap that's been around, I mentioned, for 60 years. It depends on the type of business, and so just imagine that the valuation person that you hire is the IRS has somebody just as qualified. We used to have one of our planners who used to work with us. He worked for the Justice Department in the estate and gift tax area, and he used to litigate the IRS estate taxes. And he said, look, everybody's getting looked at. If you follow the revenue ruling and didn't get an appropriate valuation, then I'm not going to litigate that. I've got a low-hanging fruit and a stack super high of people that are doing poor planning, poor valuations. So if you want your clients not to have an X on their back, make sure they get a high-quality, golden valuation.
Yeah, so the valuation's the same, and what you're leveraging here is we discussed in the example is you're leveraging what are very legitimate tactics around discounts for lack of marketability, lack of control, those type of things. So your valuation, because of what you're trying to accomplish here, usually will incorporate those thing. So you're valuing the business appropriately, but you're able to leverage those type of discounts and maybe some other techniques, estate planning techniques that will help you get the maximum value down to that next generation.
Well, and the other thing I'll add to this is that the valuation of those non-voting shares at $7 a share, there was no guarantee that the industry was going to stay strong. There was no guarantee that the company was going to grow to be $48 a share. It was the valuation that any one of us would have paid at that point in time for some non-voting minority interest in a closely held company. And the good news is we were anticipating that, if it does go according to plan, wouldn't it be good to get it out of your estate now?
Okay. Another question on the sell options that you've been discussing. Do you see cases where owners with multiple family members, for example, whose companies are in several lines of businesses, where they decide to maybe sell one or more of those lines but retain others and continue to run what's kept, or maybe keep part of their real estate portfolio if there's a likelihood of getting a higher price? I mean, do you see that kind of transaction, preparation and execution?
Oh, absolutely.
Joe, why don't you go ahead? Because the answer is yes, but Joe, if you want to go ahead and start it off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think part of the exercise is you're really looking at your next dollar and how should I be handicapping that next dollar. And there are different cycles that some of the companies are going through. And I could think of when we had a cable client decided to sell because people were willing to pay 3 times what it was worth. And so they went ahead and sold because of the opportunity cost of selling that cable company. Or it goes back to the competitive strategy of, I've got these, say, 3 different business lines. Where would I hold them, fold them, or double down with my next new dollar? And if I can get some chips off the table at something that's at the peak of the market that long term we're not going to be as competitive in, and take those dollars and reinvest into an area where I think we do have the right factors of production, the right industry, the right game plan, right positioning, and have more dollars to execute on that, then it's a constant balancing, looking at all your assets and just sort of handicapping what you view as your best positioning of your next dollar.
And the other thing that we commonly see, and I think, David, you had it in your question, is we will see owners that will hold on to the real estate. Actually, it may be owned separately, while the company's up and running. So as we talk about balancing both sides of planning for both sides of these lives, and we're doing the plan, what do I need at the end of the day? Often that rental income that they can continue to receive from that property will play into that, with the possibility of they can sell the property on down the road.
Well, plus a passive asset as opposed to an operating asset helps with some of the balancing of equalization among those that are non-active versus those that are active.
Excellent. Well, we have a couple of other questions, but we're coming up to the top of the hour here. I'll hold off on these questions, but they will be provided to Joe and Mark for individual follow-up, perhaps after the presentation. So, April?
Yes, thank you. Thanks again for joining us, Joe and Mark, and everyone who tuned in here. We hope you'll visit the Family Business website, familybusinessmagazine.com, and participate in upcoming webinars. Also,